So we're going to talk a little bit about the loft framing and some of the specialty details that you need to take care of to make sure that the loft is stable.
Okay.
So before you guys put this up, I saw you were running the sander. And why do you guys do that?
Well, basically, we choose, out of this member, we chose the ugliest side, and we mark that up. And then we take the sander to smooth it and to give it a nice appearance.
Okay, so then this is not going to get any further treatment, so it's actually
Correct.
exposed from below.
Correct. So from this point forward, it's very important to protect these, not to hit them with other pieces of framing material or with tools, because it will nick the material.
Okay.
And then it'll just show
And we
up.
want a beautiful house.
That's correct.
All right. So then when you're installing these loft members, what you're doing is you're bringing them in and you want them to bear on the top plate. But then that leaves an awkward gap here from the inside. So
Right.
what do we do next?
So what we do, we have a 1/2 inch filler we put into here. Being that the 2x4s are 1.5 inches and our wall is a 3.5. So we'll put that in, and that brings us flush to the inside of the wall.
So what'd you say? It brings it flush to the
Brings
inside?
it flush to the inside of the wall. So when we do the planking on the inside, we can continue on up until we hit the ceiling. So we have something to nail our planking into.
It also gives a nice clean look from the inside.
Right, and then also we have our boards that go on top of here, and then there's another plate for the rafters to sit on. So it's just more nailing for when we put the plate on for the rafters, more secure.
And so then what material are we going to use for the floor of the loft?
We're going to use a 3/4 tongue groove board, and we'll have the groove down, I think it is. We'll have the groove down.
Okay, so we're installing it actually upside down from the way you normally would.
That's right.
And so you're going to put this on before you even start framing for the roof.
Right, and the reason we put it upside down is so there's more character on the bottom,
Which is actually your ceiling in the kitchen.
and then there's less grooves on the top, which this will be the loft, so there's less grooves on the top.
Okay, so then now we've got it to the point where you're going to start talking about installing this flooring. So you're going to bring this piece in like this, is that right?
No, this piece will actually keep back a little bit, and you notice the grooves if you're looking at it from the end. If we don't put a trim piece on the end, you'll be down in the guest room and you'll see the grooves.
And you also see that kind of maybe potentially ragged cut.
Correct.
All right.
So what we're going to do is we're going to do the 1.5 inches, and then we'll butt this right up to it.
Okay, but then when you start framing for your roof, you've got a little bit of an issue here. So that's why the plans call for this piece, right?
That's right. And that brings it up nice and flush, and then we add the 2x4 on top of that, and this will actually be the plate that the rafters will bear on.
Seems very solid. The tongue and groove flooring for the loft is an important part to make sure that you have a sturdy floor when you're laying on your mattress in your nice loft space. So to install it correctly, there's a couple of things that you need to know so that you don't actually damage the piece that you're installing.
Exactly.
So Alan, how do you get this done?
Okay, well, first of all, we nail right here on the groove. That way your nails aren't exposed on the top here. We always have the tongue out that way so we can nail into the tongue.
So you don't nail into the groove, you nail into the tongue.
Exactly.
And would you say that's like a 30-degree angle, a 45-degree angle?
Probably more like a 15. It's not
Oh,
much
it's
at
not
all
much.
because this is rounded so your nails will never interfere.
Okay.
And then we glue everything first. You don't want to put too much on because if you do, it will ooze out the sides and then it'll be exposed underneath and you don't want to see that. And then I'll start on this end because this is the end that'll be exposed because of this. You want to make sure you have a nice cut right here.
And you make sure you snug it up against this trim piece.
Right. And then you use this block, just any scrap piece of block, and you put it in the groove right like that. And then you pound on that instead of this piece, because if you do this piece, you're going to ruin the tongue. And then the next piece you put on, it won't go
fit.
in. So you just go like that. Make sure it's nice and snug. I do 3 nails right like that. And just angle your nailer a little bit, just so the nails kind of go back in instead of straight down so it doesn't interfere with your next piece.
So then Alan, if you're not lucky enough to have a air gun on hand, how would you be installing this?
Then I would use hand nails and just trim nails. These are 2 inches long, and you do the same thing. Go right here in the groove or the tongue, angle your nail a little bit so that it kind of draws the board back. Just pull in like this. Be very careful not to go too far because you're going to hit the tongue and it'll break that off and you'll make a mark here. So just take it in like that. Then you take a nail set. Just take it in till it's flush with the top.
To the point of framing in your rafters and putting on your roof, there's a couple of important things that have to happen here structurally. So let's talk about these cuts down here that you've made.
Okay, we'll start here. This is obviously the plumb cut, and this is where the faceboard will get attached. The cut on the bottom is really just for character, so when you look in underneath the faceboard, it has some character instead of just a long point going down. This cut is the most important one. This cut, this is where it sits on the wall, and this is called the bird's mouth. And that's where it sits onto the wall. And then this cut is where we snug up against the wall. And obviously we have another, this is a 12-12 roof, so we have a 45-degree angle. So obviously we have a 45-degree angle there to snugly go in against the ridge beam as well.
So a 12-12 pitch, that means for every 12 inches of run, you've got 12 inches of rise.
Exactly.
So then when we're doing a pitch of a roof that's not 12-12, what's another angle that we might end up laying out?
If we had an 8-12, obviously there would be 8 inches of rise per 12 inches of run.
All right, and so then you figure all that when you're making all these cuts, and that impacts the drop cut on the end.
Sure.
And this cut here by the rafter beam.
That's right.
All right.
Okay, so now I'm going to show you how to lay out a rafter. And obviously it's a 12-12 pitch, which equals a 45. And a speed square is a very unique tool to use. So we'll start on the top of the rafter. First, this is the plumb cut on the top. And then there's a very detailed drawing on the plan. So we're going to pull from the long point, and we'll come down 5'10" and 9/16. Square down, and that is the long point on the bottom. So again, we're 12-12 pitch, which is a 45, and this is the plumb cut at the faceboard. Now the plan calls for an 1.5 inch trim cut, so we'll measure up 1.5 inches, and again with it being a 12-12, everything equals a 45. Now we have the trim cut determined. Now the tricky thing is we need a bird's mouth. So we're going to come back and we go off of the short point of the plumb cut on the top where the ridge pole is, and that dimension is 4'9" and 7/16. And it also shows for us to have a 2-inch seat cut on the bird's mouth. So what we'll do is, again, we're on a 12-12. We'll come in here. Now because there's a 2-inch seat cut, we'll make a mark at 2 inches. And this will also, because it's a 45, this will also equal 2 inches. So we have a 2-inch bird's mouth, which is called the seat cut, and then we have a 2-inch plumb cut on the back side of the bird's mouth as well. So at this point, we're ready to cut the rafter. We have our rafters cut. So what we did, we went ahead and installed a rafter on this side and installed a rafter on that side. But it's important to keep some spacing between the rafters on the top for the ridge beam. So what I did is I cut a block the exact width and the exact height of the ridge beam and put that between the two rafters to keep some spacing. And that also gives us the height of the post. The post should snug up to the bottom of the block which will then hold the ridge beam in place. The other thing is it's important to plumb the post, and then you have a reference point. You can measure from here to where the stud is and measure from here to here, and that tells you where to put your studding. The other thing we did is we put a 2x4 on the side of the rafter, and we put a 2x4 below the rafter. And what that does, this will be the nailer for the paneling when it comes up on this wall, and this acts as a nailer for the roof paneling. So the other important thing is to add the blocking at the plywood seam. This is the sheet that was continued up from the wall below. Now there's a seam here, and this is the sheet on the top. So we were able to nail that together to make a nice secure seam. The easiest way to set the ridge pole is what we did. We set this rafter, and we set the rafter on the other side. And then you could put a temporary post here down to the loft, and then bring the ridge beam up and set it into the pocket that we talked about on the other end, and then bring it into this end and set it on the temporary post. And then that enables you to nail into each side. And that is what will hold your ridge beam in place until all the other rafters are secured into place.
What is the logic behind the spacing that we've got going on here with the rafters?
There's a couple different options on spacing. Obviously, our sheets of plywood are 8 feet long, and so if we go 2 foot on center, 24 inch on center, that will equal out to 96 inches for a full sheet. Now, say if we went like every 20 inches, that would equal 100, so we won't have a plywood seam right on the rafter. The other option would be to go 16 inch on center, and then that equals out to 96 inches as well for the sheet of plywood to land on both ends.
So this piece here, what purpose is this serving?
This is from the short point here to the center of this is the 48 inches, and the sheet of plywood is 48 inches wide. So what we'll do, we'll nail 3 inches on the seam, and we'll also nail 3 inch on center up here. And then we'll nail 6 inch on center in the field
To
of the
attach
piece.
that piece.
Correct, and then we'll also nail into here. Now what the additional blocking, what it'll help stabilize the roof when traveling down the road and you have the wind forces on the front. It'll help stabilize the roof from racking.
All right, and then this piece here, I've heard that called bird block before. Is that what this piece is for?
Yeah, this works as a couple different ways. Obviously our siding comes all the way up, so we can attach our last piece of siding into this. And then also on the inside, our insulation will come down and it'll hit this as well. So it'll be a stop for the insulation.
Can you describe what this is doing?
This attaches the 2 rafters over the ridge pole, and what it does, it'll keep the building from separating. So we have a few nails on either side, and then we also have 2 nails into the ridge pole, and it'll keep everything from pulling apart.
And then you're going to repeat this at each joint all the way across.
We will.
All right.
And then we'll bring our plywood all the way up to make a true peak.
All right. When you're framing in for your skylights, there's a couple of design features that you want to keep in mind. Even though the spacing between the rafters is sufficient to just frame in for a skylight and place it there, that isn't necessarily the place that you want to locate your skylight. So sometimes you'll run into a situation where your skylight is going to fall right where a rafter would run down and hit the base plate. So there's an interesting way to frame this in, and functionally it looks a lot like a window frame where you have a double header and then a sill plate, but because it's on an angle, it's a little bit different and it might be a little more difficult.
Right.
So how do you achieve this skylight placement when you have it running through a rafter like this?
Once you know your rough opening and you have this cut, then you take 2, just like this. And you bring them in, you'll nail it into here real good, and you'll nail it on each end, and then nail these 2 together. And the same on the bottom. Because your skylight is only 21-inch rough opening, and this is a lot more than 21 inches. It's 40.5. And down here, you see where the 2 windows are, so we're centered in between those two windows like we talked about earlier. And I have marks up here. So I'm going to measure from that side and go 12.5. Come down here, do the same thing, 12.5. X is going to be back. My 2x4 is going to be on that side. And then this 2x4 is going to go in right on those marks. And from those marks, I'm going to do the rough opening of the skylight, which is 21 inches in this case.
So then what you end up with is clear 21 inches from one face of the 2x4 to the other face.
Right,
All
in
right.
between, and then your skylight will fit right in.
Sounds good. From a design perspective, skylights aren't just beautiful or allow you to have a nice breeze in your bedroom. They're also a secondary means of egress in case of an emergency. So if you were ever in a situation where you would be trapped in the loft, the skylight, because it opens, gives you a second means of getting out, besides just the ladder over down into your living space. So it's important at Tumbleweed that we always keep in mind of safety, and this is one of the features that we've designed into the Cypress model specifically for this purpose.
All right, so we have the two different styles of hurricane clips. And what these are for, it's an additional attachment to secure the rafter to the wall and keeps the roof from your tiny house from blowing away. The one on the outside, you just bring it up from the bottom until it's tight, nice and secure. And then we have a place for 3 nails on either side into the plates, and also 3 nails into the rafter on either side as well. There can be the other one that's installed on the inside. And that one just simply goes right like that, nailed into the plate, and then it's nailed into the rafter. And it keeps your rafter nice and secure. Okay, so one thing I'm going to mention on the hurricane tile on the outside is notice how the hole is very low. And you need to be very careful that as you drive that nail in, the bottom of the rafter tail does not split off. So there's a couple things. You can drill a pilot hole just a little bit smaller than a nail before you drive the nail in, and that should avoid the splitting of the rafter tail. Another thing you could try is maybe use a short screw instead of a nail. But you just want to be careful that you don't split the bottom of the rafter tail. Now the fun part. So we have all our rafters set in place, and it's important to put a 1/2-inch piece of sheeting on the end. Now the tricky part is to figure out, okay, how do we figure out the length of this rafter? But we're in a 12-12 pitch. It's a 45-degree. So with a 12-12, the run and the rise are always exactly the same. One of the important things you want to do is keep a pattern of your bird's mouth and your plumb cut, because if you install all your rafters and you don't keep a pattern, then you have to start over again with the bird's mouth and that. So what we do is keep a scrap piece with the pattern so you can just trace it onto a new rafter. Now the hip rafter is a little bit more challenging because it does not come out to a true 12-12. But if you have a speed square, it has 2 sets of markings. Okay, so we have the common cuts, and here's a 12-12. Notice the hip and valley. The 12 on the hip and valley does not line up with the 12 of the common cuts. So now we're talking about a hip rafter, so we need to jump up to the hip and valley 12. And the easiest way to figure this out is obviously we have a 2 7/8 inch rise, but we will not have a 2 7/8 inch rise on the corner, because the 2 7/8 inch rise is actually coming plumb from the outside of the sheeting. When we cut our bird's mouth, we won't be able to cut a bird's mouth that fits this exactly. Our bird's mouth will actually be cut like that. So the easiest way to figure that out is we're coming out a 3/8 of an inch, and if I measure over on my pattern, I measure over 3/8 of an inch, and I determine a new height. Now I'm left with a 2 3/8 inch rise. So what I did is I cut a block at 2 3/8, and this acts as my rise. Now notice how I have it flush to the corner. Leave the block there, and now we can pull the dimension. it gives us a dimension of 56¼ . Now, as you'll notice, I'm going to use the hip and valley 12. So from the long point, and that is also a hip and valley 12, that's not a true 45, it brings us to our 56¼ . So we go ahead, and a lot of times I'll just keep an extra long tail. It's hard to figure out the tail exactly, so we'll go ahead and cut that later. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the little fun hip jack rafters. And the easiest way for us to do that, we already have our pattern kept back. So I'm going to have the measurement here. This one falls on 16, and come up here and do the 16 as well. Okay, so the easiest way to draw this dimension is to take the dimension from here, not actually from up here, but to draw the dimension at this point, which is 24 7/8. Now the important thing is you already have your pattern, so you draw your dimension out of the bird's mouth to the very long point. Now this is still compound cut with a 45 bevel and also a 45 angle. All right, so I talked about earlier about just leaving this run wild. So now it's time to trim that up so the faceboard comes together in a nice corner. So the easy thing is just to take a straight edge, to make a little mark. And there again, I'll use my speed square, and I'll go to the hip and valley 12 and not the actual 12/12. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and set my saw on a 45 degree. Remember your safety glasses. Instead of using the speed square, you can also use a little level. That works just the same. Okay, so now we're going to do this nice little reverse back here. And the overhang, we have a 4 3/4 inch overhang before the faceboard is put on. So what I did here is I measured out, we have our piece of plywood on from this side. I measured out 14 5/8. And now if I'm measuring 14 5/8, that determines where this point is. And then we go the additional 4 3/4 inches from there, and that brings us to this point. Now if you look on the elevation, you'll notice that the faceboard of the reverse is lined up with this wall. So that is now this point. This point lines up with the outside of the wall. Okay, so we have a 4 3/4 inch overhang here, which will bring us to about a 5 3/8 inch overhang after the faceboard is put on. So I'll measure back another 5 3/8 of an inch, and that determines where the face of our rafter will be. Okay, so we have our line snapped where the face of the gable will be. And the easiest thing to do for that is now to measure out from our line, which is 24 5/8, and that gives us a mark at 24 5/8. Okay, so we have the length of our rafter figured out, but we also need to be center of the building. So what I did is I figured out where the center of my building is, and I brought a mark up here so I know where the center of the ridge will be. Now my ridge pole is 1.5 inches wide, so half of that will give me a 3/4 inch. So if I measure in from the end, a 3/4 inch, I have 24 inches. So I'll come up to the top, and I'll draw a line at 24. Now we need to determine our length for a ridge pole from here to here. So the easiest thing to do is to get a scrap piece of wood with a 45 and hold it in here until it comes to the edge of your 24. And we'll make a mark on the top. And then we can draw the dimension for the ridge beam. and it will be a dimension of 21 inches. So now that we have the rafter, the gable installed, and the ridge beam, I also added the nailer for the piece of sheeting to be nailed into. And notice it's important to nail into the rafters down below to hold the piece securely. And this is the one last piece. This is called the sleeper plate. And this is also the 12 hip and valley on the angles. A lot of times what I'll do is I'll get a scrap piece and hold it into place and make a mark there, and also make a mark here. And down on the bottom I'll do likewise. Make a mark on the roof and to here. And then you can draw your dimension from this point to this point. And notice how they're different. And this is the same with the hip and valley 12. We have the 35 degree and also the 55 degree, which equals the 90. The final thing you'll want to do is don't cut your piece of plywood flush to here. We need to cut it out at this point to complete the overhang.
Called roofing paper, also sometimes called tar paper. It's an important part of a vapor barrier for your home. So this will go on before you actually start installing your roofing. Just like with the Tyvek, it's important to make sure to overlap an appropriate distance and to install using the correct fasteners as per the manufacturer instructions. You'll want to make sure to overlap them with the direction of the wind, so that as you're traveling down the road or hauling this to your new location, the wind doesn't accidentally grab a panel and rip your roof off.
Than just big flat panels. You have a lot of trim here. Why don't you tell us how that all works out?
Okay, well, let's start in the beginning. First of all, put your drip edge on the bottom. Do that before you do anything. So it's important to put your bottom piece of metal on first. And what we did is we cut it up about 12 inches or so past the point of this valley. Then we took a piece of valley flashing, it's about 12 inches up on each side. We laid it right in the valley, overlapped it on top of this metal. Then we take a piece of metal, put it on here, and I recommend going about 2 inches from the valley with the cut of your metal. You can see that nice straight line up through there, 2 inches on each side. And as I said before, you want to make sure you stay at least 5 to 6 inches away from the point of your valley with your screws. That way when water comes down through, it won't run up and hit your screw. Okay, now we're going to talk about gable trim. And what I mean by gable trim, that's the trim you put on anytime it's on the end of the building at the peak, which is this right here. Okay, so we put our metal on and we brought our metal out to the edge of the faceboard. Then what we did is we took this piece of gable trim and capped the edge of that metal and the top of the faceboard to give it a nice appearance and also to make that waterproof so that as you're traveling down the road, you don't have rain and all kinds of other fun stuff going in there. Okay, now we're going to talk about counter flashing. And what that is, anytime a roof meets a wall, you want to put a piece of counter flashing. This is about 5 inches by probably about 4 or 5 inches, goes up the wall. So you put that on top of your metal, then that goes up about 4 inches, then you put your siding on top of that. Now we're going to talk about the hip cap. If you see, we brought our metal over, we brought it right up to the peak, right to this point, this side and this side. Now we need something to cover that rough edge, and that's what's called the hip cap. So we put that on, we put a screw in at every rib. Another important thing is to make sure you put your foam filler strips up underneath here, so as you're driving down the road, you don't have rain going in behind there. Okay, now we're going to talk about the ridge cap, and that's the same idea as the hip cap. When a peak meets, you have the rough edge of the metal. So now you need to cover that. So we just take this piece of metal, put it over, and again, you make sure that you put foam strips in underneath there to keep the weather out. And then you put a screw, and you want to make sure it's at least a 2-inch screw so that it hits the wood in underneath. Put that at every rib.
When you're all done with your roofing, to make sure you've done it all properly, imagine rain hitting the topmost part of your roof and running down. It should always encounter a situation where it's channeled on top of the next piece and never under it. You can see here the Fishers have done a really good job on finishing up this roof so that there's no possibility for rain to get under a lower panel. And that's what you want. That's it for roofing. If you need additional information, contact us at tumbleweedhouses.com.